What's going on, Leaguers? Welcome to the Spectacular Spoiler League. I'm the Pandan Superman, the mayor of Hype City HazyRome, and as always, I'm joined by the Gotham Knight, the Prime Minister of Post-Production, DeepBoyce. And DeepBoyce, we are here in the Hall of Spoilers with the League to talk about X-Men Dark Phoenix and how it can be better than the much-loathed X-Men The Last Stand, aka X3. Which
X3.
also interpreted the Dark Phoenix saga, or tried its best to do so.
Yes, sir. I mean, that's probably the low point of all the X-Men films.
For sure.
I mean, it's up there
Well,
with...
maybe X-Men's Origins Wolverine. G-Bus. J-Bus. That was bad.
I don't even count. Fine. Yes, we're going to put... Yes, that is the worst. One of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. But we got news that the next X-Men film will delve into the Dark Phoenix saga. We don't know if that's what it's called, X-Men Dark Phoenix. No, we just know that's...
I think that's official. That's the official title, X-Men Dark Phoenix, or at least it's going to be called Dark Phoenix. I assume it's going to be called X-Men Dark Phoenix. That just seems to be the general naming convention, but it is going to be called Dark Phoenix.
Yes.
That is confirmed.
Yeah, it's going to touch on the Dark Phoenix saga, which is one of the best-selling, most important storylines in comic books, period. Especially for the X-Men, put them on the map, or helped continue to put them on the map. And like Hazy said, X-Men 3 sort of delved into that as well. And we're going to sort of talk about what this upcoming movie can do to maybe improve on what they weren't able to do with X3, what Brett Ratner wasn't able to do with X-Men 3.
Particularly 5 ways
Yes.
that this movie could redeem the terrible job that Fox did the first time in trying to adapt the Dark Phoenix storyline.
Yes, sir.
So, to start things off, man, number one, numero uno, they need to sell us on the Cyclops and Jean Grey relationship.
Yep.
All right?
That's probably...
Bring that back to the forefront.
Yeah, see, we kind of have Wolverine out of the picture. Listen, I like Wolverine, but Wolverine is not the center of the X-Men. And that's kind of what they went for with pretty much most of these X-Men movies. But if you're going to do a Dark Phoenix storyline, you have to really push Cyclops and Jean Grey. Oddly enough, this is really the first time where this love triangle became a thing. And now that they don't really have Wolverine, it's kind of interesting that they're going to go ahead and do the storyline again. But I think that's totally fine. They don't even have to have a love triangle. Just really push us forward with the storyline between Jean Grey and Cyclops. Obviously, Jean Grey is probably the main character. She's like the main focal point if this is about the Dark Phoenix, because she is the Phoenix. Right. And this will take some years after X-Men Apocalypse, so they probably already in a committed relationship, or maybe they're going to get into one. But it has to be one of the pivotal points of this movie, and they have to really know how to execute this correctly.
And they have an uphill battle in that respect, because they really only peppered that in X-Men Apocalypse. You know, just the fact that they are, drawn to each other, intrigued by each other, so to speak.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, X-Men Dark Phoenix is supposed to take place in the 90s. So you could essentially skip like 10 years. And a lot can happen in 10 years. Yeah. That'll bring us to another point that we talk about later on in the video. But essentially they need to play up that relationship, man. Yeah. But our next point, okay, this is gonna require a little bit of prefacing with some of the history and the origins of the Dark Phoenix character, and I'll leave that to DeepBoyce because he's way more of an expert in that field than I am.
Yes.
So take it away.
Well, Dark Phoenix saga heavily involves a lot of elements that haven't even been introduced into any of these movies up until this point. We're talking about the Shi'ar, the Macron Crystal, the Starjammers, Hellfire Club, Eric the Red, etc., etc. A lot of stuff to kind of jam into one movie.
You just named a lot of things that nobody knows about.
Yes. And they don't have to, because at the end of the day, they can maybe sprinkle in a few of these things in many different ways. This could be an introduction into the cosmic aspect of the Fox Marvel movies, because the Phoenix Force is heavily tied to the Shi'ar, who are an alien race that the X-Men often liaison with one another. But obviously, if you're trying to tell this one story about Jean Grey, the X-Men, and the Dark Phoenix, at best you can maybe put the seeds of a lot of these character elements into the story, and you can do without maybe the Hellfire Club, which you already did in X-Men First Class.
Right.
You don't really have to throw in the Starjammers at all because the Starjammers are a team of pirates led by Cyclops' father. That's going to get way too convoluted. And then, of course, you have a lot of the characters like Eric the Red, which they don't really have to include at all because they're pretty minor when it's all said and done. But they kind of used, they kind of got into some mystical ancient stuff when it came to X-Men Apocalypse with the Apocalypse character, so they can kind of delve into the idea of the Phoenix Force and the backstory. They can kind of circumvent all the convoluted space stuff by maybe, creating their own little story about where the Phoenix Force comes from and just leave it to myth and legend to not really make this movie too convoluted and too much going on into it.
Sure. I mean, if they did want to sprinkle a little bit of cosmic side of things and open that realm up, they could honestly say, the Phoenix Force is, essentially, the idea of ancient aliens, where ancient people encountered the Phoenix Force, this alien, celestial being, but in the minds of these ancient, peoples, they could only interpret it as a goddess or a manifestation of some elemental force or some type of force of nature to kind of explain that away, but sprinkle a little bit of the cosmic side of things into it as well. But ultimately, like you said, it might be a tall task to fully tackle the cosmic world.
But some Easter eggs and some, alluding to a few things in there. Sure, why not? It's not really pivotal. It's not really pivotal because it was done in the X-Men cartoon where they had a lot more time to lay this out, and they didn't really get too crazy with that either. So there's still a way to do it that's fun for people to watch and makes this a healthy movie and allows us to have healthy sequels to this.
Yeah, so I guess in that respect, we're in agreement with, something from X3 in that you might want to avoid the cosmic side of things.
Yeah.
That being said, man, let's move on to the next thing that we feel like Dark Phoenix can do to make it better than X3. And that's a more established X-Men team working together.
Yes. I honestly think that they have no excuse but to finally have an X-Men team that works together using their powers. You have Cyclops out there in the lead. You have everyone kind of just using their powers together in order to solve problems. Playing to their strengths and trying their best to hide their weaknesses. And since we have a period of time going from X-Men Apocalypse, which was in the 80s, to the 90s, the X-Men have probably already been working together for quite some time, and they're already, well-versed as a crime-fighting team or defense force or whatever it is they're going to go with in this movie.
Sure. And one of the plot points from Apocalypse, one of the threads that were kind of left dangling was this idea that mutants, when they were just being accepted by humankind, something catastrophic happened, and now the face of mutants as something welcoming is in question. And I think an interesting way to have the X-Men team have a conflict in X-Men Dark Phoenix is start off with the X-Men as this fully realized team that's been working together for, let's say, 10 years, since it's the next decade. And, let them be a face for mutant acceptance in the wake of Apocalypse. But the Jean Grey Phoenix Force manifestation, let that be kind of like a wrench in that the perception of the X-Men.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Kind of throw the X-Men for a loop in that respect, and public perception for a loop as well.
Yeah, because some people see them as heroes, some people see them as necessary, but some people also see them as a potential threat, and they're not wrong in that, because these are just kids or young adults with extraordinary powers. And what if one of them loses their minds or loses control or decides to switch sides, like Magneto, who is a wanted terrorist and has been for quite some time.
Agreed. And I think what better way to throw a challenge to the X-Men team than to have one of their own go rogue, essentially, with Jean Grey being overtaken by the Dark Phoenix. I think that's an interesting route for them to go. And, it's not a route that's really been explored in the X-Men movies where, the X-Men are somewhat liked or operate, not in the shadows. it's almost like they're just hated, regardless. But what about if you take them from an approach of a stance of, being somewhat accepted, but then this Dark Phoenix saga just ruins everything for them in that respect, and everything goes to hell.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of saw shades of that with Mystique, and that after Days of Future Past in X-Men Apocalypse, she was seen, at least by mutant kind, as some sort of hero.
Yeah.
And I think that might be a good way for them to go in terms of the X-Men team, especially to see the X-Men team fully realize, like, we really haven't seen that in the movies.
Yeah,
you know
absolutely.
what I mean? And I think that would be a good way to go.
And I think this could also be a chance to not just show the lack of trust that the public has on the X-Men, but maybe the lack of trust that the X-Men have with themselves.
Right.
Maybe they had a good period where people were liking them, and then they start to think to themselves, are people right? I mean, look at the destruction that Jean has done. She's one of us, and she's just lost her mind. What would happen if that happened to me? And that could also be an interesting plot point to explore in this movie.
Indeed, man. Moving on to the next way that Dark Phoenix can be better than X-Men 3. The Rise of Mr. Sinister. DeepBoyce, man. You've spoken to me a lot about Mr. Sinister and his fascination with Scott Summers and Jean Grey. What could his role in the movie be, man?
Yeah, well, at the end of X-Men Apocalypse, they do hint at the Essex Corporation, which is Nathaniel Excess's company, Nathaniel Excess being Mr. Sinister, and he's a big X-Men villain who is obsessed with gene manipulation and, forced evolution. So there are a lot of plot points that they could go with there where they have Mr. Sinister. Maybe he sees the Phoenix Force as something that he can use for his own experiments, maybe weaponize it, maybe for his own self, maybe to further evolve mutants and mutant kind. Or maybe he sees the X-Men as lab rats, maybe nothing more than to just push forward his, own scientific endeavors. Or maybe, since he's also been a lackey of Apocalypse, maybe that's another tie into X-Men Apocalypse, where he was in the shadows this entire time as someone that's been, worshiping Apocalypse, and now he kind of comes in to his own to really take advantage, as another threat from this Apocalypse cult.
And we specifically say the rise of Mr. Sinister, because one of the things that the X-Men franchise has seriously been lacking is a villain other than Magneto.
Yes.
And it's very clear that they've, and rightfully so, they've played up this idea that, Magneto is this character that struggles between the good and the bad. And they've done that really well in the current, era movies. And by that, I mean the quote unquote first class trilogy. Yeah. But I think that the X-Men franchise has really lacked a bona fide villain. Yeah. And Mr. Sinister could be that villain, especially if, you're putting Cyclops or Scott Summers and Jean Grey at the forefront of, these, the new age of X-Men movies.
Yeah, make him into a super strong villain, one that could be in future films. I mean, you're talking about a character that is sometimes nearly indestructible because he can sort of regenerate from almost anything. So it really opens up the avenues for you to have this character go one-on-one against the X-Men or have his own team of, genetically modified soldiers or creatures or things. Something that I guess we haven't really seen either besides, maybe good mutants versus bad mutants is, the X-Men versus a formidable team. Maybe Mr. Sinister can bring that to the forefront in the X-Men Dark Phoenix.
Absolutely. And last but not least, the X-Men Dark Phoenix film needs to take advantage of the 90s setting. That needs to be a tool in the plot of this story. Because one thing we saw in First Class was they capitalized on a real life event, the Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Yes.
In Days of Future Past, they capitalized on the Vietnam War armistice, the Treaty of Paris, and Mystique doing something seriously crazy on the world stage in an area or arena where everyone's watching. And one thing I feel like Apocalypse was missing is that they didn't really, other than the style of dress and the musical choices, they didn't really play into some of the socio-cultural aspects of the 80s.
Indeed.
And with the 90s, there's a couple of things that I feel like they could play into if they so choose. In particular, I mean, one of the things we talked about was that in the 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, and it signals the rise of the United States as an American superpower, as the world superpower. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Sinister, a character who's always in some way looking for power, and they've already kind of made him, he has Essex Corporation, so he's obviously, as this big name player, maybe this is his play to, gain some more power on the world stage.
Yeah.
And, there's other 90s events and conflicts they could use too, like the Gulf War as well. Is one that we had discussed. And I think that somehow they need to incorporate the 90s in the same way they did in First Class and Days of Future Past.
Absolutely. Totally agree. I mean, a lot of your audience is going to be very familiar with that era. And I think that's one thing that could set these movies apart from all the other superhero movies if you really focus on them being period pieces. Yeah.
Right.
Like you said, First Class, that was one of the dope things about it, where it took place. Days of Future Past, same thing. They could have done that a little bit better in Apocalypse, but there were elements of that. You could definitely take advantage of the setting of the 90s, either for story elements or just to pay homage, because the 90s were also an important period for the X-Men. So, make use of that. Let's see some colors. Let's see some cool costumes.
Yes, absolutely. But what do the Leaguers think X-Men Dark Phoenix needs to do to be better than X3? What do you think it needs to do to tell the Dark Phoenix story the right way? Unlike X-Men The Last Stand, which we hated. It was bad. Terrible. No more. No mas. Please. Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you liked anything you heard in this video, feel free to drop us with a like and hit the subscribe button to join the league, because we need you guys in the Hole of Spoilers. Me and DeepBoyce, we're getting out of here, though. We'll see you guys on the next one.
Peace.